The Lost Legion of Crassus, the Roman-Chinese connection. In 53 BC, one of the most disastrous battles in Roman history took place in the deserts of modern-day Turkey. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the man who defeated Spartacus, marched 40,000 legions into the Parthian Empire seeking glory. He found only death. At the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthian horse archers annihilated the Roman heavy infantry. Crassus was killed, legend says molten gold was poured down his throat, and 20,000 Romans died. But the real mystery concerns the 10,000 survivors. According to the few fragmented records that exist, these prisoners weren't executed. They were marched east. The Parthians, needing border guards to protect their own eastern frontier, transported these elite soldiers thousands of miles away to the province of Margiana, modern-day Turkmenistan. And there, the Roman trail goes cold. For 2,000 years, Western historians assumed these men died in obscurity, slaves in a foreign land. But they didn't just die. They kept marching, right off the edge of the known world and into the history books of a completely different superpower, Han Dynasty China. This is the ultimate historical glitch in the matrix. The detective work requires cross-referencing Latin defeats with Chinese victories. 17 years after the Romans vanished, in 36 BC, a Chinese general named Chen Tang was leading a campaign against the Xiongnu, ancestors of the Huns, in what is now Kazakhstan. The Chinese chronicles, specifically the Book of Han, describe a bizarre encounter during the Battle of Jiji. The Chinese troops faced a unit of foreign mercenaries fighting for the Xiongnu, who didn't fight like nomads. They didn't ride horses. They stood foot to foot in a disciplined square. Most shockingly, the Chinese historian Ban Gu recorded that these warriors interlocked their shields into a fish-scale formation to block incoming arrows. Military historians froze when they translated that line. The fish-scale formation appears nowhere else in Chinese military history. It is, however, a perfect description of the testudo, tortoise formation, the signature tactic of the Roman legion. The chronicles also mention the foreigners built a double wooden palisade around their camp, a standard Roman engineering practice that nomads never used. Yet the evidence suggests the impossible, a lost Roman legion fighting as mercenaries for the Huns, clashing with the imperial army of China. Two massive empires that were never supposed to meet had collided in a dusty corner of Central Asia. The Chinese won the battle, and impressed by the discipline of these strange warriors, they didn't kill them. They captured them and moved them into Chinese territory to guard the border. They named the new settlement Liqian. In ancient Chinese, Lijian was likely a transliteration of legion, or perhaps Alexandria. The town was settled by the ghosts of Rome. But the story doesn't end in ancient scrolls. It ends in a genetics lab. In the early 2000s, scientists and historians visited the modern village of Liqian, now Zhejiang, in Gansu province. They found a population that defied local genetics. And its villagers had green eyes, aquiline noses, and fair hair, traits almost unknown in rural Han China. DNA testing conducted in 2005 revealed that over 50% of the villagers carried Caucasian genetic markers. The locals had long told legends of their ancestors being great warriors from the West who practiced bullfighting, a Roman, not Chinese, tradition. So, why was this erased? Why isn't the war between Rome and China in every history book? Because it breaks the narrative. Historians love clean lines, Rome in the West, China in the East, separated by the Silk Road. The idea that a Roman legion walked all the way to China and became Chinese citizens sounds like bad fiction. It was an anomaly that the system of history couldn't process, so it was ignored. The Lost Legion serves as a reminder that the ancient world was far more interconnected than we are led to believe. These men were the ultimate survivors. They survived the Parthian arrows, the march across Asia, and the wars of the Huns, only to be absorbed by a new empire. They didn't disappear, they just merged into a new story, proving that while empires fall, soldiers just find a new master. The Sea Peoples, the apocalypse bringers. Around 1177 BC, the entire civilized world committed suicide, and the weapon used was a mysterious confederation of warriors known only as the Sea Peoples. This isn't just a story of a lost army, it is the story of the greatest murder mystery in human history. In a span of just 40 years, every major city in the eastern Mediterranean, from Troy to Hattusa to Ugarit, was burned to the ash layer. The Hittite Empire, a superpower equal to Egypt, collapsed overnight. The Mycenaean Greeks vanished into a dark age so deep they forgot how to write. And in the middle of this carnage, Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III recorded the only clear evidence of the killers on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. He described them not as a nation, but as a conspiracy of confederated tribes coming from the islands, sweeping through the Mediterranean like a human hurricane. They were heavily armed, bringing their families with them, suggesting this wasn't just a war, but a desperate migration. They destroyed the world's trade networks, toppled kings who had ruled for centuries, and then, after breaking the spine of the Bronze Age, they simply disappeared from history. Who were they? For centuries, archaeologists have treated them like ghosts, a convenient plot device to explain why the ancient world collapsed. But the detective work reveals something far more disturbing than just barbarians at the gate. Modern analysis of pottery shards, DNA, and linguistic traces suggests the Sea Peoples were actually us. They were refugees. One of the Shurden, Shekelesh, and Peliset mentioned in Egyptian records were likely displaced people fleeing from Italy, Sicily, and the Aegean, driven mad by drought, famine, and economic collapse. The systems of the late Bronze Age were incredibly brittle. Kings controlled all food and trade. When the climate shifted and the crops failed, the system refused to adapt. It kept taxing and demanding, so the people became the army that destroyed it. The Sea Peoples terrified the world because they were the symptom of a global system failure, a rebellion of the desperate against the elite. They were unstoppable because they had nothing to lose. But the greatest mystery is their erasure. After their final battles with Egypt, which Egypt barely survived, this terrifying force didn't build an empire. They dissolved. The Peliset settled in the Levant and became the Philistines, eventually being erased by the Assyrians and Babylonians. The others merged into the populations they conquered. They destroyed civilization and then vanished into the dark age they created. History erased them because they didn't write books. They only burned them. The Sea Peoples proved that even the most sophisticated global economies can be wiped out in a single generation if the system fails the people, leaving behind nothing but ruins and a mystery that detectives are still trying to solve 3,000 years later. The Black Army of Hungary, the mercenary machine. In the late 15th century, the Kingdom of Hungary built something that wasn't supposed to exist yet. A fully professional, standing army equipped with futuristic technology. While the rest of Europe was still relying on feudal levies, farmers handed spears and told to march, King Matthias Corvinus assembled the Fekete Sereg, the Black Army. They were a terrified anomaly in the medieval world, a force of 15,000 to 20,000 hardened veterans who fought not for loyalty or land, but for a salary, and they were lethal. Historical records indicate that a staggering 25% of the infantry were armed with arquebuses, early firearms, at a time when most armies had barely 10%. They were the special forces of the 1400s, combining heavy cavalry, pavis-shielded infantry, and mobile artillery into a combined arms meat grinder. For 30 years, they were invincible. They smashed the Ottoman Turks, who were terrifying everyone else. They conquered Vienna. They kept the Kingdom of Hungary safe in a neighborhood surrounding by wolves. They were the ultimate security guarantee. But then, in 1490, they didn't just lose a battle. They were systematically liquidated by their own government. This is where the story shifts from military history to a forensic audit of a state failure. The Black Army didn't die on the battlefield. They died on a balance sheet. The detective work into their disappearance reveals a motive as old as time, money and political jealousy. The Black Army was incredibly expensive. To pay for the best killers in Europe, King Matthias had to tax the nobility ruthlessly. And the system, the barons and aristocrats, hated the army. Not because it wasn't effective, it was saving their lives from the Turks, but because it made the king too powerful. As long as Matthias had his mercenary machine, he didn't need to ask the nobles for permission to do anything. The moment Matthias died, the system struck back. The new king, Vladislaus II, was a weak puppet installed by the nobles, specifically because he would be easy to control. The first order of business? Stop paying the army. It was a deliberate sabotage. The nobles knew that if they cut the funding, the machine would break. For months, the most elite warriors in the world sat in their barracks, starving. They were owed immense back pay. When they finally marched out to demand their wages, the state branded them as mutineers and brigands. The very generals who had once led them were ordered to hunt them down. In 1492, at the Battle of Halas, the Black Army was massacred by the Hungarian state forces, the very country they had defended for decades. Those who weren't killed were tortured or sent on suicide missions against the Turks to be disposed of. The erasure was total. Within a few years, the invincible shield of Hungary was gone. The tragic irony, which historians have noted with grim satisfaction, is what happened next. Without the Black Army to hold the line, the Hungarian defenses crumbled. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, the Ottoman Empire crushed the Hungarian nobility, the same nobles who had destroyed the Black Army to save money. The Kingdom of Hungary fell and was occupied for 150 years. The Black Army is the ultimate case study of a system destroying its own best asset because it was too costly and too independent. They worked too well, they kept the king too safe, and for that, they had to be erased, even if it meant dooming the entire nation to destruction. It proves that to a corrupt elite, a solution that threatens their power is worse than the enemy at the gates. The lost fleet of Kublai Khan, the Divine Wind. In 1281, the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, turned its gaze toward the island of Japan. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, assembled a force that defied comprehension. A massive armada of 4,400 ships and 140,000 soldiers. To put that in perspective, this was the largest naval invasion force ever assembled in the history of the world until the D-Day landings of World War II. Nearly 700 years later. The Mongols had already crushed China, burned the Islamic Golden Age to the ground in Baghdad, and terrified Europe. Japan was next. The samurai, though brave, were vastly outnumbered and unfamiliar with the Mongols' gunpowder bombs and swarm tactics. The conquest seemed inevitable. The fleet arrived in Hakata Bay, ready to extinguish Japanese civilization. And then, overnight, they vanished. A massive typhoon roared through the Tsushima Strait, smashing the fleet into driftwood. The Japanese called it the kamikaze, or divine wind, believing the gods themselves had intervened to save them. For centuries, this event was treated as a religious miracle or a freak weather accident. The Mongol fleet was simply erased by nature. But modern marine archaeology has reopened this cold case, turning the miracle into a crime scene investigation. If the fleet was truly the terror of the world, why did a single storm destroy it so completely? Experienced navies survive typhoons. They ride them out or seek harbor. Total annihilation suggests a structural weakness that history overlooked. In the 1980s and continuing into the 2000s, marine archaeologist Dr. Randall Sasaki and his team began diving in Amari Bay, the graveyard of the Khan's fleet. What they pulled from the mud changed the narrative from bad luck to systemic failure. They found thousands of artifacts, but the smoking gun was the ships themselves. The forensic analysis of the wood and the hull designs revealed a shocking truth. The ships were doomed before they ever left port. The Mongols, being horsemen, had forced their vassal states, specifically the Chinese and Koreans, to build this massive fleet in an impossibly short time frame. The archaeological evidence shows that many of the ships were not ocean-going vessels at all. They were flat-bottomed riverboats, repurposed for the open sea. A flat bottom is great for the Yangtze River. It is a death sentence in a typhoon-tossed ocean because it lacks a keel for stability. Furthermore, the wood analysis showed that the builders had used rotten or recycled timber to meet the Khan's insane quotas. This wasn't just a weather event. It was a failure of the imperial bureaucracy. The system of the Mongol Empire, built on terror and impossible demands, created a hollow armada. The Korean shipbuilders, pressured to build thousands of ships in 1 year, likely cut every corner imaginable, or perhaps even engaged in subtle sabotage, knowing the ships would fail. The Great Khan demanded a fleet, so his terrified subjects gave him one that looked impressive on the surface but was structurally rotten. When the wind blew, the illusion collapsed. The divine wind didn't destroy a mighty fleet. It exposed a fraudulent one. The world's most terrifying army didn't disappear because of gods. It disappeared because of government corruption, rushed contracting, and the arrogance of a ruler who thought he could command the sea like he commanded the steppes. The wreckage in Imari Bay stands as a testament to the fact that you can force men to build ships, but you cannot force physics to keep them afloat. The fleet was erased by the very tyranny that created it. The sacred band of Thebes, the lovers' army. When we think of the 300, our minds immediately jump to the Spartans at Thermopylae, the pop culture icons of masculine sacrifice. But there was another 300, a unit far more dangerous, far more successful, and far more terrifying to the ancient world. That history has conveniently forgotten. The sacred band of Thebes was the only military unit in history comprised entirely of 150 pairs of male lovers. The theory was psychological engineering. A soldier might abandon his commander, but he would never abandon his beloved. He would fight with the ferocity of a man protecting his soulmate. And it worked. For 40 years in the 4th century BC, they were the nuclear option of Greek warfare. They did the impossible. They broke the Spartans. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, led by the genius commander Pelopidas, they shattered the invincible Spartan phalanx, ending centuries of Spartan hegemony in a single afternoon. They were the elite of the elite, the special forces that redefined power in the Mediterranean. So, why aren't they in the movies? Why is their tactics studied less than the Roman legion? Because they were erased by the very man who studied them, Alexander the Great. The detective story here is about the deliberate dismantling of a rival power. Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander knew that to conquer the world, Thebes had to die. The sacred band was the physical embodiment of Theban defiance. The clash came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. This wasn't just a battle. It was an execution of the Old World Order, the Macedonian phalanx armed with the long sarissa pikes. He pinned the Greek allies, while Alexander, then only 18 years old, led the cavalry charge directly at the sacred band. History tells us the rest of the Greek army fled, but the sacred band did not. They stood their ground, surrounded, fighting to the last man. They refused to surrender, and they refused to abandon each other. For 2,000 years, the exact fate of these 300 men was a matter of rumor. Did they really die together? Or was it a romantic myth? The smoking gun was found in the late 19th century during an archaeological excavation at the foot of the Lion of Chaeronea, a massive stone monument erected on the battlefield. Digging beneath the soil, excavators found a mass grave containing 254 skeletons, laid out in 7 solemn rows. They were scarred by battle, arms linked even in death. In this physical evidence proved the legend was a cold, hard fact. They hadn't run. They had been massacred in formation. But the erasure goes deeper than just the battlefield. Philip II, walking through the carnage, reportedly stopped at the bodies of the sacred band, wept, and cursed anyone who spoke ill of them. Yet, despite this respect, the Macedonians ensured the sacred band was never rebuilt. They destroyed Thebes shortly after, wiping the city off the map. The Romans and later Christian historians found the concept of an army of lovers uncomfortable and immoral, so they slowly edited the sacred band out of the primary narrative of military history, focusing instead on the hyper-stoic Spartans. The sacred band was an experiment in the power of human connection over brute discipline. It worked too well. And it proved that love was a stronger motivator than fear, a dangerous idea for empires built on control. So, they were killed, buried, and their legacy was sanitized, leaving only a stone lion to mark the spot where the true 300 made their final stand. The Janissaries, the betrayed elite. For nearly 500 years, the Ottoman Empire was the superpower of the Mediterranean, and the engine of that power was a unique military experiment, the Janissaries. They were the first modern standing army in Europe, created centuries before the West adopted the concept. But their origin was a dark secret. Through the Devshirme system, the Ottomans took Christian boys from the Balkans, converted them to Islam, and raised them with a single purpose: absolute loyalty to the Sultan. They were forbidden from marrying or owning businesses. The army was their father, their mother, and their god. They were the perfect soldiers, highly disciplined, fanatically loyal, and terrifyingly effective. They were the shock troops who conquered Constantinople in 1453, They smashed the armies of Europe at Mohács. They were the sons of the Sultan, living in the heart of the capital, feared and respected by all. But as the centuries passed, the experiment began to backfire. The Janissaries realized a dangerous truth. If the Sultan relies on us for power, then we hold the power, not him. The perfect servants became the masters. By the 17th and 18th centuries, they had mutated from an elite fighting force into a mafia-like deep state. They dethroned sultans they didn't like. They murdered leaders who tried to reform them. They ran protection rackets in Istanbul. They became the system itself, a bloated, corrupt, and untouchable corporation that refused to modernize. They still fought with swords and muskets while European armies were adopting modern drilling and artillery. They had become a liability, a firewall blocking the empire's survival. This leads to the single most brutal act of corporate restructuring in military history, known euphemistically as the Auspicious Incident. This wasn't a war, it was a cold-blooded, premeditated liquidation. Sultan Mahmud II, who ascended the throne in 1808, spent 18 years smiling at the Janissaries while secretly plotting their extinction. He knew he couldn't just disband them. They would kill him like they killed his predecessors. So he built a new secret army trained in European tactics, hidden away from the capital. He slowly placed loyalists in key artillery positions overlooking the Janissary barracks. On June 15, 1826, the trap was sprung. The Sultan announced a minor reform, knowing the Janissaries would revolt. Predictably, they overturned their soup cauldrons, their traditional symbol of mutiny, and marched on the palace. But this time, the palace was ready. Mahmud II didn't send negotiators, he sent grape shot. The Sultan's new artillery units opened fire on the Janissary barracks in the crowded streets of Istanbul. When the Janissaries retreated into their quarters, the Sultan ordered the buildings set on fire. Those who tried to escape were cut down by the new army. Those who stayed were burned alive. By the end of the day, 6,000 of the empire's elite were dead. In the weeks that followed, another 20,000 were hunted down and executed across the empire. The Janissary name was banned. Their tombstones were smashed. Their Bektashi religious order was outlawed. The Sultan erased 500 years of history in a single summer because the tool had become more powerful than the user. And it is the ultimate lesson in the danger of elite forces. They work perfectly until they gain consciousness, and when they do, the system doesn't hesitate to burn them down to protect itself. The Janissaries were not defeated by an enemy army. They were erased by the very throne they were built to protect. The White Company, the Wandering Death. In the 14th century, Italy was not a country. It was a cage match of warring city-states like Florence, Milan, and the papacy. But the most terrifying force on the peninsula wasn't a king or a duke. It was a corporation. The Great Company of English and Germans, better known as the White Company, was a private military contractor centuries before Blackwater. Comprised of veteran killers left unemployed by the pauses in the 100 Years' War, they drifted south into Italy and turned war into a racketeering business. Under the command of the brilliant and ruthless Sir John Hawkwood, they were unstoppable. They introduced the longbow to Italy, a weapon that could punch through plate armor from hundreds of yards away. They fought on foot in heavy armor, a steel wall that shattered the undisciplined Italian cavalry. For 30 years, they held the richest cities in the world hostage. If you paid them, they fought for you. If you didn't pay them, they burned your crops, sacked your towns, and strangled your economy. They were the ultimate disruptor in the market of violence. Popes begged them for mercy. Kings emptied treasuries to bribe them. They were the masters of Italy. And then, the corporation dissolved. The White Company didn't suffer a catastrophic defeat like the Mongols or the Romans. They weren't buried by sand, they were erased by the ledger. The detective story here reveals the cynical truth about privatized war. A mercenary army is only a threat as long as it is independent. The Italian states, particularly Florence, realized they couldn't kill Hawkwood. So they bought him. The erasure was bureaucratic and financial. The system, the wealthy banking families of Florence like the Albizzi and later the Medici, realized that the White Company was a bad asset to leave roaming free. They offered Hawkwood a massive pension, citizenship, and legitimacy. They turned the wolf into a watchdog. The moment Hawkwood accepted the contract to become the Captain General of Florence, the White Company, as an independent terror organization, ceased to exist. The rank-and-file soldiers were either absorbed into city militias, paid off to retire, or drifted away to die in minor skirmishes. The terrifying entity that had dictated terms to popes was dismantled not by a superior army, but by a human resources acquisition. Our history remembers Hawkwood as a hero of Florence, complete with a fresco in the cathedral, conveniently forgetting that for decades he was a gangster who terrorized the very people who painted his portrait. The White Company was erased from the narrative of terror and rewritten into the narrative of state glory. It proves that in the history of power, if you cannot destroy a monster, you put it on the payroll and pretend it was yours all along. The experiment worked. They proved that war could be a business, and they were closed down the moment that business was acquired by a bigger monopoly. The Dahomey Amazons, the mothers of war. In the 19th century, the Kingdom of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, deployed a military unit that defied every social construct of the modern world, the Mino, or Our Mothers. To the terrified French soldiers who faced them, they were known as the Amazons. This was not a small ceremonial guard or a harem with swords. This was a standing army of 6,000 frontline combat troops, fully integrated into the state's military structure, constituting nearly a third of Dahomey's entire fighting force. They were the tip of the spear. Trained from childhood to ignore pain, they filed their teeth to points and were armed with Winchester rifles and razor-sharp machetes. They were the only female army in documented history to fight in major wars against a Western industrial power. And they didn't just fight. They terrified the French Foreign Legion. During the Franco-Dahomeyan Wars in the 1890s, French officers reported a psychological shock among their troops. The legionnaires, hardened veterans of colonial conquest, hesitated to shoot women, only to find themselves beheaded seconds later by a warrior who showed no such hesitation. The Amazons were disciplined, fearless, and lethal. In hand-to-hand combat, they were reportedly superior to the French infantry. They were an experiment in total mobilization, proof that biological sex had no bearing on the ability to kill or conquer. But after the war ended, they didn't just retire. They were systematically erased by a colonial system that found their existence intolerable. This is where the story becomes a case study in cultural genocide. When France finally conquered Dahomey in 1894, thanks only to the overwhelming superiority of machine guns and heavy artillery, they didn't just disband the unit. They launched a campaign to scrub the memory of the Amazons from the culture. The French colonial administration viewed the Mino as a barbaric anomaly, an affront to the civilized European values, where women belonged in the kitchen or the church, not on the battlefield. The system went to work. The remaining warriors were stripped of their weapons and forced into domestic roles. Their training centers were demolished. The colonial schools taught a new history, where Dahomey needed to be saved from its own savagery, conveniently omitting the fact that the savages had nearly humiliated the French army. For decades, the oral history of these women was suppressed. They were portrayed in colonial literature not as elite soldiers, but as bloodthirsty monsters or harem slaves, stripping them of their agency and military brilliance. The last known survivor of the Amazons, a woman named Nawi, died in 1979, living in a remote village, largely ignored by a world that had forgotten her legacy. It wasn't until recent years, with forensic historical analysis and pop culture resurgences, that the true scale of their sophistication was rediscovered. The Mino worked too well. They proved that gender roles were a social construct, not a biological reality. That truth was dangerous to a colonial empire built on strict hierarchies of race and gender. The French couldn't just defeat them. They had to pathologize them, turning a military elite into a cultural problem to be fixed. The Amazons were erased because they challenged the fundamental assumptions of the men who wrote the history books. They showed the world a different way to be powerful, and the world punished them for it by forgetting they ever existed. The lost army of Cambyses II, the vanished legions. In the year 524 BC, a massive military force, 50,000 soldiers strong, marched into the Egyptian desert and simply ceased to exist. They were the elite shock troops of the Achaemenid Empire, the superpower of the ancient world. They carried the finest bronze weaponry, wore heavy armor, and were led by the commanders of Cambyses II, the King of Kings who had successfully conquered Egypt. This wasn't a disorganized raiding party. It was a highly disciplined, logistical machine capable of crushing nations. Their mission was specific and brutal. March across the Sahara to the Oracle of Amun at the Sawa Oasis, enslave the population, and burn the temple to the ground because the priests refused to legitimize Cambyses' claim to the throne. The army set out from Thebes, marching for 7 days into the deep desert. They reached the oasis of El Kharga, the last known outpost of civilization. They resupplied, checked their gear, and turned west into the Great Sea of Sand. They were never seen again. No messenger returned, no survivor stumbled back to the Nile, no debris field was ever officially recorded. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing decades later, provides the only clue we have. He reports that while the army was pausing for a midday meal, a south wind of catastrophic violence, a Khamsin, rose up. The sand, he wrote, came in pillars so vast that it buried the troops while they were still standing, erasing 50,000 men from the topography of the earth in a single afternoon. But does an entire army just vanish? For centuries, historians and archaeologists treated this account as a myth, a convenient story invented to explain a military failure. How does the desert swallow 50,000 men, thousands of pack animals, and tons of metal armor without leaving a trace? This is where the detective work begins, and the story shifts from a natural disaster to a historical cold case. If the wind killed them, the evidence should be preserved, a Pompeii of the desert, waiting beneath the dunes. For 2,500 years, adventurers searched for this lost army. Countless expeditions failed, often nearly dying of thirst themselves. The desert protects its secrets well. But in 2009, 2 Italian archaeologists, the Castiglione brothers, found something that history had overlooked. They didn't look on the standard trade routes. They hypothesized that the army, trying to avoid ambush, took a different, more treacherous path. Exploring a desolate valley under a massive rock shelter, they found it. Not the whole army, but the smoking gun. They discovered bronze daggers, arrowheads, and silver earrings consistent with Achaemenid fashion. They found hundreds of bleached human bones and pottery shards dating exactly to the era of Cambyses. The evidence suggests that the disappearance wasn't just about the wind. It exposes a terrifying reality of ancient warfare and the fragility of even the greatest superpowers. The army didn't just get lost. They were likely betrayed by their guides, led into a death trap where the terrain itself was the weapon. But there is a darker theory that historians whisper about: political erasure. Shortly after this army vanished, Cambyses II died, and Darius the Great took the throne. Darius was a master of propaganda, and some modern Egyptologists suggest that the sandstorm was a cover story. It is entirely possible that this army didn't die by wind, but was defeated by a rebel Egyptian force, or perhaps they mutinied against a mad king. Admitting that the elite Persian army was defeated by rebels or traitors would have shattered the aura of Persian invincibility. So, the official record was changed. The wind became the culprit. The history books were written to blame nature, not incompetence or rebellion. The vanishing of Cambyses' army is the ultimate example of how fragile power actually is. One day, you are the enforcement arm of the greatest empire on earth, terrifying the known world. The next day, you are dust, buried under meters of silica, erased not just from life, but from the memory of your own people. The desert didn't just kill them. It hid the truth of their demise, allowing the empire to continue as if they never existed. It was a perfect crime, committed by the sands and covered up by the state. The experiment of imperial expansion hit the physical limit of the natural world, and nature simply deleted the intruders. The 9th Legion Hispana, the Ghost Legion. In the annals of Roman history, the Legio Nonis Hispana was a legend. 5,000 of the empire's most elite killers, veterans of campaigns across Europe, bearing the symbol of the bull. They were the iron fist of Rome and Britain, stationed at the northernmost frontier of the civilized world. And then, around 120 AD, they marched north into the mists of Caledonia, modern-day Scotland, and walked straight off the pages of history. One moment, they are listed in the imperial registry. The next, they are gone. No records of their discharge. No accounts of their battles, no tombstones mentioning their later lives. They simply ceased to exist. For centuries, the official narrative, and the plot of movies like The Eagle, was that they were massacred in a chaotic ambush by the Pictish tribes, all wiped out to the last man in the fog. But if 5,000 Roman soldiers were slaughtered, where are the bodies? Where is the equipment? Rome was obsessive about recovering its eagles and burying its dead. The total absence of physical evidence suggests a massive cover-up, a deliberate damnatio memoriae, or erasure of memory. This is where the historical detective work gets dark. We know that in 122 AD, just after the Ninth vanished, the Emperor Hadrian visited Britain and immediately ordered the construction of a massive wall, Hadrian's Wall, separating the empire from the north. You do not build a wall across an entire island if you are winning. You build a wall when you have encountered something you cannot defeat. The construction of the wall is the smoking gun that proves a catastrophe occurred. But recent archaeological finds in Nijmegen in Netherlands have complicated the story, revealing tile stamps of the Ninth Legion dating to after they were supposed to be dead. This hints at a conspiracy even deeper than a massacre. Perhaps the Legion wasn't killed in battle, but was disbanded in disgrace. Did they mutiny? Did they flee? Or did they suffer a defeat so humiliating, so total, that Rome decided to erase their name from the records rather than admit weakness? The Roman political machine relied on the illusion of invincibility. If a bunch of barbarians in Scotland could wipe out an elite legion, the whole empire might revolt. So, the system fixed the problem by deleting the data. They may have transferred the survivors to the worst corners of the empire, split them up, and swore them to secrecy, effectively erasing the corporate entity of the Ninth. And whether they died in the mud of Scotland or were dissolved by a stroke of an imperial pen, the result is the same. The Ninth Legion serves as a terrifying reminder that institutions can disappear overnight. One day you are the pillar of the state, the next, the state decides you are a liability and you are edited out of existence, leaving historians to chase ghosts for 2,000 years.